The cost of living is obviously beginning to hurt, but there's one issue that I want to raise with you specifically, and that's the cost of getting to and from work is rising. And as you well know, Minister, the government have taken some steps to try to combat the cost of fuel. Obviously, they haven't been able to combat it adequately for the very many in the country who have to travel to work, and it's costing people more and more to get to work. Obviously, it has to pay to be at work. You've created economic conditions where a huge amount of employment has been created in this state. That is to be welcomed. A very large amount of that employment is in low pay. That is a problem, and it's particularly a problem when it's costing people money to get to work. But there's a cohort that I specifically want to bring up with you, and that's those who drive as part of their work. Not just have they to drive to work, but they have to drive as part of their work. Public health nurses are one example, but there are very many across the public sector, and there are very many across the private sector. The civil service set rates for people who drive as part of their work, and it's a certain amount per mile. It's been changed to kilometre, but it's public service mileage. But it doesn't just apply to everybody in the public sector, although it does right across the public sector, HSE employees, revenue employees, right across the public sector. But many, if not all, employers in the private sector use the same rate. In fact, revenue reference it. Now, the rate at which people are paid for driving as part of their work dates from the 1st of April, April Fool's Day 2017. Now, I think, Minister, you can't but agree that the cost of driving has increased hugely since the 1st of April 2017. In fact, the cost of driving has increased hugely since the 1st of April 2022. So I'm asking, while there's a broader issue around the cost of fuel, the cost of living, and we can address all that if you want, but specifically, will you, as Minister for Finance, change that mileage rate to enable people who drive, not just to and from work, but as part of their work, to be able to do so without it coming out of their pocket, so that they're not actually subventing the employment that they're engaged in for the benefit of their employers, whether it's the HSE, whether it's any entity of the state, or whether it's the private sector? Because that type of work is becoming unaffordable for those who engage in it.
Thank you, Deputy McNamara.
So that is a very detailed question, Deputy McNamara, and thank you for raising it with me regarding the funding that the state makes available to cover a share of the travelling expenses for those who work on behalf of the state. Maybe this is a matter that will form part of the engagement in relation to the public sector wage discussions that are currently underway, and the government hopes we will get to a point that they will lead to a conclusion that will be both fair and affordable. It is a matter that the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform is responsible for, and I was involved in the setting of that rate in 2017, and I remember some of the discussion around it. I do take the point that obviously the cost of travel and commuting has fundamentally changed in the last few months, let alone since 2017. But maybe this is a matter that can be dealt with in the discussions that are underway that do, I hope, lead to a new agreement in relation to public pay.
And to be honest, I was hoping for something a little more commitment from the Minister that it would be addressed as part of it, not that it might be, or that hopefully we'd get there. I mean, it absolutely needs to be addressed. You talked about the general measures the government have taken, but you also spoke about the money that was spent earlier, and of course the cost of fuel is something that couldn't really be predicted because it's caused very directly by the conflict. But inflation is something that was very predictably driven by the monetary policies that your government, like many governments across the world, pursued throughout 2020 and 2021. And I mean, America in particular is now bearing the brunt of the policies that Joe Biden brought in. They may have been well-intentioned. I accept that they were well-intentioned, but they have been catastrophic. And the reason that the cost of fuel is hurting people so much is because it's mirrored by costs right across the system. And that inflation including food inflation, which the government is doing nothing to combat the input costs, which will be passed on in next year. Those costs will be passed on to consumers, further driving inflation.
Deputy Minister.
So, I mean, the reference that you made to monetary policy there is interesting because it's the monetary policy that was in place that allowed the government to put in place the huge support during the time of COVID that Deputy Batchik referenced there a moment ago. And I think there are a few economists that are claiming that it is the budgetary response that have been put in place by governments that have led to the inflationary pressures that we're now facing in Europe. Well, I think it's a critique that's developing in other parts of the world, but as Deputy McNamara will be aware, it could be the case that the higher level of savings that are present within economies after COVID here in Europe is playing a role. But what's playing a far bigger role is the impact of the war in Ukraine and supply chains that were really weak and fragile after the effect of a pandemic. You say to me you would have been hoping for a more detailed response. As I said to you, you put to me a very detailed question about an aspect of how we pay and recognise our civil servants, and it's not up to me here to prejudge what could happen in the wage negotiations that are underway, and indeed it would be very unhelpful for me to do so. But what I will do is I'll follow up on the specific matter that Deputy McNamara has raised with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and I'll come back to you with a more detailed answer on it.